Hey everyone, I'm Mason White, a composer, and for the last year or so I've been making covers of Shin Megami Tensei songs in the style of Shoji Meguro's battle themes from the PS2 era of SMT games. I've always adored his specific style and sound from the time and have spent years of on and off searching looking to recreate his guitar tone in particular. I've learnt a lot about how he writes his music over this past year, and I want to share what I know in the hopes that maybe someone else can find this stuff helpful, or even make their own covers. I get plenty of comments and emails asking about how to create or find various sounds and the like, so hopefully this video isn't too little too late. This video will be covering not just how to sound like Meguro, but also how to compose like him. And while I'll be focusing primarily on his work during the PS2 era, plenty of the information in this video can also apply to his work after. There are already several videos and resources dedicated to his sound, particularly during the Persona 5 days, so I want to cover the information from the PS2 era. Also, while I feel I'm pretty confident about how much I've learnt about his style, there's still a lot more to discover. I'm still finding some commonalities in his composing style every now and then, and the Persona sound resource is consistently finding new synth patches, sample CDs, presets, etc. that were used around the time. So if there's anything that you've noticed or want to mention, please go ahead and leave a comment. We're all here to learn something. Now before we get into the specifics, I want to clarify exactly what we're talking about. Shoji Meguro had a very unique style and sound to his battle tracks between the releases of Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne in 2003 up until Catherine in 2011. You can hear him start to lean towards it with Muck and Shao in 2001, but he wouldn't truly get to the style we know until 2 years later. And releases featuring Meguro's work started to slow down after Catherine, but you can notice a pretty drastic shift in guitar tone and other elements as early as Persona 4 The Animation and Golden in 2012. So that sets the time period we're talking about, and these are the games in particular that feature this specific style. The style itself is something we're all familiar with. I generally call it epic rock, but it's more unique than that. It features plenty of heavy guitars with soaring leads that give a sense of energy and melancholy. Battle tracks in particular often follow a common structure of a very simple riff under a prominent melody, a softer or calmer section to bring things back a bit and change the mood slightly, and then a powerful climax of epic melodies and chords that make each battle feel like an otherworldly experience. Not all of them follow this structure exactly. In fact, the style is very flexible. You'll almost always find some guitars in there, but other instruments may or may not include pianos, synths, trumpets, strings, or even some vocals. He would alter the style slightly for certain soundtracks, like a more techno-influenced variant for Digital Devil Saga 2, a brassier trumpet-filled variant for both Raidou games, or a slightly more experimental rap and vocal sample influence in Persona 3. I'll do my best to cover everything that I can in this video, and I'm also going to put this knowledge to work by creating a new original track in this style, as if it was a lost song from that era. I've been wanting to try this for quite a long time now, so it'll be a good chance to put the theory into practice. So let's get to how these tracks typically work. I went over the basic structure earlier, but I want to really break down the typical progression that these songs follow, as it's what I'll be using for my track. Most of the PS2 era battle tracks will start off with an intro that establishes a simple riff. This riff continues as a melody is introduced, often on guitar that carries throughout the whole section. Other elements may come and go, but the intensity will gradually increase before the next section. We'll call this the A section. And when I say that the riffs are simple, I mean it. They're often very easy to play and aren't too complicated in order to give some precedence to the melody. There may be some other counter melodies, extra harmonies, or layering that is generally brought in as the section continues, but things don't get too complicated just yet. In fact, the A section is often just in one chord to keep things heavy and intense for the beginning of the track. Then most of these tracks will transition into a softer, slightly more mellow B section. This gives a small break from the intensity, which will allow the next section to be much more of a climax. In this B section, Meguro will often either bring things down a notch but still maintain a sense of battle, or really begin to sell a bit of melancholy. You can go either way really, and I'll play an example of each. You're likely to hear some clean guitar during this section, maybe some pianos and strings. Or in the other case, you'll hear most of the extra elements stripped away while the rhythm guitar will finish the riff. From here, Meguro will often either bring everything to a stop or quickly build some tension before a new melody transitions us into the next section. Then we have the C section, or the climax. This is the section that sells the track and makes it memorable. Regardless of whether or not we've been on one chord the whole time, we are guaranteed to hear an epic chord progression here that is backed by power chords on the rhythm guitars. The progression itself will almost always hit the flat 6 chord somewhere, as that's where the most power and emotion is going to come from. I've noticed that Meguro either consciously or unconsciously tries to stay away from the standard flat 6, flat 7, 1 chord progression that is often used to make things very epic and melancholic, as plenty of other composers will. It's a great progression, but Meguro tends to move them around and toy with them to make an uncommon, yet still epic progression. Aside from that, everything is at its peak here. A strong and memorable, somber yet powerful melody is the most important factor here for sure. From here, the song might transition back to the A section and the loop resets, but sometimes there's a D section. This section is somewhat similar to the B section, but mostly is just a continuation of the C section. Almost like a shorter, slightly less intense version of the climax for a little while before the loop. I'm going to make sure to follow this structure pretty closely for the original track. It's super important and a surefire way to making your track have that Meguro style. From here, let's break down some of the instruments used in these tracks, some of their sound sources, and how to write them. This is obviously the most important part of the process, so I'm going to make sure to get into deep detail here. I've got some timestamps below if you're looking for a specific instrument, but for now, let's get started on the guitars. Without a doubt, the most iconic part of these tracks is not only how the guitars are written and played, but also their distinctive tone. To this day, I still haven't heard a guitar tone that quite matches what Meguro achieved here. It is something truly unique. To say that he only used one specific tone though is a lie. Not only were his rhythm, lead and clean tones very different, but the settings of each changed from track to track. In terms of gear, Meguro primarily used a 1974 Fender Stratocaster through a Line 6 Pod 2.0 amp modeler. This is true for rhythm, lead and clean tones. Now the guitar itself isn't too important, but I'd recommend a Stratocaster with 3 pickups as he tends to switch between them pretty often. And while not having the exact guitar is going to sound slightly different, you're likely going to need to do some extra EQing anyways, and this can help you get there. More importantly is the Pod, and that's an amp modeler released in 1998, but Meguro had the second version which released in the year 2000. The Pod itself has quite the legacy amongst guitarists and is something that was used in tons of game soundtracks throughout the 2000s. Notable examples include Sonic Adventure 2 and many other Sonic games afterwards, Dead or Alive 3, Devil May Cry 2, Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3, that Arrange album from Italia Iris Eternal Manor that features that one track you might recognise from a certain Mariland video back in the day. And even in Shin Megami Tensei 9, which predates Nocturne by a few months. This stupid little kidney bean has some pretty distinct sounds that I and many others love that you won't hear nowadays, and that rings especially true for Shoji Meguro's work. It seems that he made the switch to Guitar Rig 6 by Native Instruments. Anyway, I'll get into how I personally recreated each tone. I'm far from an expert at this sort of thing, so you could definitely find a better and more accurate tone with some fiddling. It's been a bit since I made these tones, and frankly I'm too scared to touch them at this point. The rhythm tone uses a modified version of the modern high gain preset. Here's a photo of my settings on top of that, and some extra gain wouldn't hurt here. I usually play from the bridge pickup only, but I know that Meguro himself tends to experiment in that regard and often plays with the middle pickup a bit. From here, I add some extra EQ in my DAW to make the sound a little bit brighter, and that's pretty much the tone. There are definitely some improvements to be made, but this has given me a pretty dead ringer for his overdriven heavy guitars. There's an old archive blog that Atlas developers used to write on that features a lot of super cool and useful information. Meguro himself had a post where he tested out other guitars using the Tweed Blues preset on the Pod, and after listening to it, you can definitely tell that he used this for rhythm sections in certain tracks. terms of composing and playing rhythm guitar, things aren't too complicated. Make sure to always be in standard tuning as no tracks go below E standard. Play power chords and basically no other chords. The only technique you'll be playing with is palm muting and pretty much nothing else. I mentioned earlier that Meguro riffs are usually very simple, and that extends to all of his rhythm sections as well. Make sure that the climax of the song is carried by power chords with plenty of palm muting that follows the chord progression pretty tightly, and you've got yourself a nice Meguro rhythm section. The lead tone is much more complicated and tends to vary much more than the rhythm. I still personally use a modified version of the modern high gain preset using these settings, but please feel free to tinker around and see if you can't find something more accurate. Again, I play using the bridge pickup primarily, but messing around with the pickups will also get you an accurate sound. This needs a separate EQ again, and this one is much more fiddly. Try to boost the high end, but don't neglect your mids. Now the most crucial aspect to this tone is layering. He doesn't often do it throughout an entire song, but Meguro layers his leads by an octave during the climax section of almost every track from this era. It's what makes things sound so huge, and the resonating frequencies add plenty of fullness and emotion to the sound. Meguro himself seemed to have 2 tracks, the original lead and an octave above playing the lead identically. I personally find a richer sound by having the original lead and then 2 tracks of an octave, panned slightly left and right. How it sounds is only half the battle though, as playing the lead is its own can of worms. Meguro plays primarily in a legato style with plenty of long-held vibrato notes. He uses plenty of techniques but absolutely loves hammer-ons and pull-offs. You'll hear them very often in his work. There are some bends here and there, some palm muting and some rare pinch harmonics as well. Every now and then he'll play some parts as a double stop, primarily in Nocturne tracks, but this is pretty uncommon. That's pretty much it though. His parts are never that fast or tricky to play, and they're plenty of fun to practice, even for a beginner guitarist. Obviously some songs are much trickier than others, but I have some great memories of learning to play guitar using Hunting from Digital Devil Saga. His clean tones are fairly interesting and still tend to have a nice amount of distortion on them. For these, I almost always play from the neck pickup or slightly towards the middle pickup. After plenty of testing, I'm fairly confident that the Tweed Blues preset with some extra tweaks is what Meguro used, but other presets may be more accurate. I apply some extra EQ as well as some effects depending on how things are played. This could be some slight chorus, delay, plenty of reverb. It all depends on the part itself. Overall, the sound is very heavy on the high end, so EQ accordingly. Now, Meguro rarely used his clean tones in a lead melody, but more often as background parts. Sometimes he'll play some funk-inspired strumming like in Sakudo Cho, or will arpeggiate some notes like in The Darkness of Tsukigata, This is usually accompanied by some delay and chorus effects. When strumming, he'll often play power chords of the tonic with some light raking of the strings. To be honest, this is the tone that I'm the least confident about, and I strongly encourage you to experiment if you give this a go. Every track that features clean guitar sounds slightly different, so it's clear that Meguro himself was messing around with it quite often back in the day. The bass in Meguro tracks is never super complex. I don't think he's ever used a live bass in these songs, and still doesn't in his more recent work. I don't think that it's currently known which bass libraries he may have used for the battle tracks, but it isn't very hard to recreate the sound. Most bass libraries will have a similar sounding picked or finger bass sound to use as a substitute. Just make sure that there isn't much high end at all. I personally just use my own live bass instead and play picked style. His bass parts are definitely written by a guitarist. Very simple and mostly just following the root note of the power chords almost exactly to give the rhythm guitars more oomph. I can tell that they were written by a guitarist because I tend to do the exact same things when writing bass parts in my original music and have to consciously try to get creative with them. Not here though. Keep things nice and simple by following the guitar. Every now and then he might have the bass play the tonic note whilst the guitar moves around a bit more, but this almost never happens during the climax of any song. The only other point to mention is the occasional fill at the end of a phrase. These aren't very common, but the best example I can think of is during the climax of Decisive Battle. There isn't too much to mention here, but occasionally Meguro used a synth bass in place of an electric one during some battle tracks. As it is the synth-focused soundtrack, Digital Devil Saga 2 is where you're going to hear this the most, but you'll hear it pop up in some other places in Nocturne and Raidou 1 for example. The patches used are different per track, so I'd really just recommend finding an example to try and mimic with your own synths. And there really isn't much to say in terms of how they're written, pretty much the same as the electric bass parts. It's clear that Meguro's drums have a lot of thought put into them, even in his more modern tracks. Both sonically and compositionally, they are made to sound extremely real despite not being live at all. It's not known exactly which drum libraries he used in earlier soundtracks, but later scores heavily used early versions of the BFD drum libraries. They're made to have a very roomy and huge sound, which is especially noticeable in tracks like I'll Face Myself, Dream of Butterfly, and Time. He still uses newer versions of BFD nowadays, and some of the legacy libraries are still available. But trying to track down most of these old BFD versions is especially tricky, as they aren't commercially available anymore, and your best bet is really just to hope for an eBay listing of a physical version. I don't have access to it myself, and I've frankly just been using drum libraries built into Logic Pro for years now. It's somewhat embarrassing to say, and not the most ideal option, but with some layering, EQ, compressing, etc., you can make some pretty great sounding drums. You can absolutely recreate a similar sound to Meguro's drums using most libraries. You just have to make sure that you can layer snares to get a fat sound, compress things nicely, have a good amount of reverb to emulate the drum room feel, and most importantly, have a range of velocities and variations available for both open and closed hi-hats. The only other thing I want to mention is the snare sound frequently used throughout Digital Devil Saga 2's soundtrack, particularly in Madness and Heroic Battle. I don't know much to say about it other than it being pretty distinct and tough to recreate. You'll notice that his drum grooves are pretty varied and feature some interesting rhythms, particularly in the hi-hats. There's plenty of mixture between the open and closed hats, the velocities they're hit with, and how they accent the snare in particular. I'm not an expert on drums or how they're written, but it's important to try and compose some slightly unorthodox rhythms when trying to mimic this style. His writing for drum parts has changed over time to be somewhat simpler. If you compare something like Life Will Change from Persona 5 to Battle Raidou 2008, or Obelisk from Nocturne, you'll notice that the hi-hats in particular are especially less varied and tend to follow a standard rhythm. That's not to say that they're always complex and can be quite simple to draw attention to other parts of a song. Having open hi-hats played as a standard 8th note rhythm like a New Battles, helps to accent the intensity of the song, rather than take away from it with a complex pattern. Synths are pretty commonplace in Meguro's style, and again, are most prevalent in Digital Devil Saga 2. The patches he used aren't very complex and are often very analog in nature. There are a variety of different synths he used back in the day, such as the Korg Triton and Trinity, Roland JD 990, and the Virus Indigo, to name a few. He also tended to use some patches found in EXS24, and these legacy sounds are still available in Logic Pro to this day. In fact, Ryota Kazuka also used some of these patches throughout the Shin Megami Tensei 4 soundtrack. There are a ton of different sounds that you could go with here, and because the sounds are pretty simple, I'd recommend trying to recreate them using other synth libraries. Alchemy or Omnisphere, Zebra, it doesn't really matter what you use, as most libraries can be tweaked enough to resemble what you're after. A good example synth I can think of is used all throughout DDS2's soundtrack and is pretty recognisable. Sometimes he'll use a harsh sync-like sound in a couple tracks. so you could try incorporating those into your work. Synths aren't usually at the forefront of battle tracks in this style, so you won't hear many prominent leads. You will often hear arpeggiators though, usually just playing one note over a section. They are very quiet in the mix, but can best be heard in something like Battle for Survival, or Enemies Reborn. It's a very tiny sound on its own, but it enhances the rest of the track slightly. Pads aren't very common in battle tracks, but more so in area themes like Kabuki-cho. The best example I can think of is in Darkness, where they are underneath the chorus. It's a very warm sound that isn't too loud in the mix, as they can easily muddy up the sound. As I said before, synths aren't often used as a leading melody in Meguro battle tracks, so try to stay away from doing that yourself. Instead, try layering them with a lead guitar, or as a counter melody, or as an extra small detail. Synths aren't really the focus of this style and are mainly used to enhance each song. In fact, they really aren't featured often in later soundtracks, as Meguro leaned towards less of a digital sound. Pianos are less common in the battle tracks compared to area and cutscene tracks, but are still featured. They are most often used in the B section of each track to bring things down a notch or to make things a bit more melancholic. It's not yet known which piano library Meguro used before Persona 4. It's a shame, as it's a pretty distinct sound that, while not sounding too realistic, has some nice tones to it. Notoriously, he has been using Native Instruments' New York concert grand piano ever since Persona 4. He still uses it now, with Metaphor Fantasio featuring it in tons of tracks. It's a legacy library that's actually still available, and for free no less. You'll just need Contact Player. He also has been known to use the Steinway grand piano patch from EXS24 in a couple tracks, so if you have that available, that's another option. I'm not much of a pianist, so there are definitely others out there who can give better advice on how to write piano parts like Meguro. But for battle tracks at least, nothing is too complicated. The left hand will often just play some chords while the right hand plays some simple melodies. These melodies can often be layered with an octave to make a fuller and brighter sound. Meguro very rarely had any piano during the climax section of tracks, so try to avoid doing that yourself. If there's one thing you might associate with the Raidou sound, it's the abundance of trumpets. Rock and brass is a really cool style that can be best heard in these games, and something like the aforementioned Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3. Meguro used AMG's Kick-Ass Brass library from Raidou 1 all the way up until Persona 5 Royal. It's a pretty great library that also comes with some saxophones and trombone sounds. And just like with the drums, a lot of care clearly went into making these trumpets sound as realistic as possible. You'll need to mess around with reverb and some delay in order to stop the trumpets from sounding so dry. Also try to make sure to use different velocities in your trumpet parts to get things sounding realistic. And it also helps to use the different articulations to keep things from getting stale, like some staccato or tremolo notes. Meguro used to write his trumpets as all sorts of things. Sometimes as a lone lead, sometimes it was layered with guitar, sometimes they were used as little counter melodies, you name it. I like to use them as counter melodies and not usually as the sole focus, but you absolutely can do so. Make sure though that you're layering the trumpets by an octave, especially for parts during the climax of a song. Layering trumpets with a soaring guitar lead is part of the reason why Decisive battles sound so huge. So I'd recommend layering them together. The strings in PS2 Meguro battle tracks has sort of a mix of roles between the pianos and the trumpets. They can be used to make things sound wistful in soft sections, or can be used as counter melodies or layered during the climax sections. The libraries used vary, but it's known that Aria of the Soul from Persona 3 to 5 uses Best Service Advanced Orchestra Sample CD, whilst the Genesis uses Native Instruments' Orchestral Contact Factory library, the latter of which may have also been used for Strange Journey soundtrack, but I'm not too sure frankly. Really though, the library you use isn't as important as how you compose when it comes to these strings. I personally have used Spitfire's intimate strings for years. It's a bit limited, but I find that they work really well for swelling strings and are a nice affordable price. Don't worry too much about the strings not sounding very real, as Meguro's didn't at face value either. It's more about how you compose the strings that will make them sound more realistic, and that goes with any string library. The most important thing to remember is dynamic range. Meguro was all about this during the PS2 era, and you can hear it in most tracks like in Formidable Foe, or Battle for Everyone's Souls. Strings are played with a multitude of different dynamics in real orchestras, so the same applies here. Have them swell or keep them quiet before ramping them back up for the climax, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure that they vary in volume. Articulations aren't really that much of a factor here actually. Most battle tracks have strings play legato only with some exceptions. The best I can think of is in Formidable Foe again, where the strings are played tremolo. Write your strings to be mostly in the higher register. You won't hear many cellos or double basses in Meguro's battle tracks, so follow suit. The last thing that I want to mention is the iconic vocals featured in Nocturne's battle tracks. It's been known for a long time that the main source of the voice is the old text-to-speech feature available on Mac OS. Specifically the Albert option, whose whole thing was having a frog in his throat. That's why the voice sounds so raspy and strange, and is pretty funny how that was turned into these demonic vocals. Obviously, you're gonna need Mac OS in order to use this, so it may be off the table. I won't be featuring it in the track that I'm making here, but I did use it for my cover of Battle Dart from Shin Megami Tensei 5, so you can hear it there. It's important to note that the voice by itself is very weak, so a lot of extra processing was done to achieve how it sounds in Nocturne. For one, Meguro mentioned himself that he recorded himself speaking the lines as well, and layered that underneath the Albert vocals. I've tried doing that in the past, but I honestly find it's more accurate to layer the vocals and pitch it down for a sort of rumbly and heavier sound. From there, you'll need to compress both of these together and put them through some sort of heavy distortion or overdrive. That's how you get that crunchy, demonic quality to it. I'd also recommend adding some delay, as is heard in normal battle. The only lyrics that we're absolutely sure of in Nocturne came from Forced Battle. These lyrics are ripped right out of the Book of Revelation in the Bible. Pair that with the King James version and you're bound to find some pretty metal and heavy lyrics. The way that Albert intonates is not something that I'm really a fan of. It doesn't sound like it belongs in a metal song because it was never supposed to. For example, Albert pronounces earth like earth, so I changed the spelling to arth in order to force the program to read it in a less shrill way. I don't think Meguro did this at all, but I find that it personally enhances the vocals. The last thing that I want to mention is timing. A text-to-speech program like Albert won't read things to a beat, so you're going to need to manually go in and adjust the timing of syllables. It's kind of a pain in the ass for sure, but you'll definitely need to do it, as it'll sound like a mess otherwise. There are a few extra little tidbits when composing in Meguro's style that I want to mention. Make sure to let your guitar parts end naturally without sudden cut-offs, even if that means trailing into the next bar. And especially make sure not to do any unnatural digital cutting like metal songs do nowadays, as it doesn't match the style at all. Meguro's battle tracks are not very long typically. With some exceptions, one loop doesn't usually push past the 2-minute mark. Try to keep your track from going on for too long, and try to make sure that it repeats once. I didn't mention anything about traditional vocals like in Persona 3 and 4. There isn't much to say about them. They have pretty standard vocal processing and harmonies and all that. Plus, unless you have the vocalists themselves on standby, you won't be matching their vocal style without plenty of practice. One last thing I wanted to mention with the synths is something that I've noticed here and there. A simple synth phrase will often stick to one note and occasionally go up an octave or just get pitch bended pretty high for some variation. That or some filters are being messed with, like the cutoff and resonance. You can hear it in tracks like Catch It and Castle. It's not crucial to the style or anything, but it's something that I've noticed over time. Overall, try not to have too much going on your track at once. Meguro is really good at avoiding mixing problems, and an overabundance of different elements is one way to have one. Keep it simple and the whole track will land harder for it. So now that we have all of this in mind, let's get to building the track itself. Now everyone comes up with music in different ways, and I happen to be one of those people that creates it in their head. So I came up with a melody and chords for the climax in my head, and then hummed it into a microphone like a dork for later. From here I like to write out my guitar parts on piano as a placeholder just to get a feel for things. For the opening section I wanted to keep things pretty simple. Just a power chord on the guitar over a simple synth phrase doing that octave thing I mentioned earlier. After a small drum fill, we move into the A section. Here I'm playing a very simple riff on guitar. Power chords only with some palm muting here and there. The bass is playing the root note of the chords exactly. The drum pattern here isn't too complex, but the hi-hats are fairly involved. I've made sure to have the range of velocities here help to accent the beats as I switch between open and closed hi-hats. I also have a fairly simple arpeggiator following the chords exactly for a slightly richer sound. The lead melody on guitar here is played once and then 2 more times, both an octave higher. With those panned to the left and right, it makes a nice and full sound. Mostly legato notes with some gaps here and there and a bend to keep things a little bluesy. As the section repeats, I've added some small counter melodies on the trumpets. Nothing very fancy, but I've made sure to layer them by an octave with some nice reverb. Some of the phrases also end in a fall to keep things sounding natural. From here we move into the B section, so we're going to bring things down a bit and go for a more melancholic sound. Starting off on a flat 6 after staying around the tonic for so long immediately hits you with a wave of change and wistfulness. The chords on the left hand of the piano switch between being played straight and arpeggiated for some variation. Lots of major 7ths and add 9 chords which carry a lot of emotion and sustain throughout the whole section. The right hand plays a melody to help accent the chords. Not much to say about it except that almost all notes are layered by an octave. The drums here are now going at half time to make sure to lower the intensity a bit. And I've made sure to keep the previous rules about the hi-hats in mind again. Right at the end of the section, I have everything build and then stop before going into the climax. The drums follow suit here as I have a flam right at the end. Meguro did this at the end of a section a few times, like in The Fog and Hunting Rare Devil. I've got some arpeggiation going on with the guitar here, and plenty of reverb and delay. I'm making sure to let the strings ring out to keep the sound nice and airy, which the delay also helps with. And I arpeggiate a power chord right at the end to help with the coming build-up. Not much to say about the bass here, it's just following the root notes of the piano chords. The strings here are played with a tremolo articulation and swell up and down. I'm making sure to have a wide dynamic range here. Right at the end of the section, I bring things back to the tonic, as some palm muted guitar comes back in playing power chords. The strings swell to their highest dynamic before everything comes to a stop on the last beat. This brings us into the C section, the climax of the whole song. The rhythm guitars are once again establishing the chord progression here. All power chords with plenty of palm muting. The chord progression itself is designed to come back to the flat 6 often and sort of dance around it. This ensures that the section will keep that epic feel. The final 4 bars follow a classic flat 6, flat 7, 1 chord progression to bring us back to the tonic and into the final section. The bass is following suit almost entirely, mostly root notes. The lead guitar comes in a bit early to play some soaring melodies. I'm making sure to play pretty strictly legato and holding notes for a while. There are plenty of hammer-ons and pull-offs in here as well to match a Meguro lead more closely in style. I'm making sure to repeat the first part of the melody a couple times, as Meguro would do this all of the time, and it's a big reason as to why his melodies are so catchy. The drums here are almost exactly the same as in the A section. Pretty standard rhythm on the kick and snare, with some interesting hi-hat stuff going on like before. The trumpets here are really only used for the repeat part of the melody, and are layered with the lead guitar for a huge Meguro-esque sound. I've kept them purposely sparse as I didn't want this to sound like an exclusively Raidou song. I've got a small pad in the back of the mix here that isn't exactly a close recreation of the pads in The Great Tokyo. But it's going for a similar effect. It's mostly just a pedal note with some variation towards the end to help fill out the mix and match the style a little bit more. Matching it exactly is the arpeggiator from the A section to give more life to this section. To close out the section, I've got some tremolo strings that swell right at the end to make a nice transition. The final section is very similar to the intro with a few changes to make it loop better. In certain songs, Meguro would have the section after the climax still keep a bit of the energy, but strip away some of the epic sound and intensity from before. Mostly, but not exclusively, sticking to the rock instruments and staying on the tonic. You can hear this in tracks like Hunting, I've done the same sort of thing here. The guitars are playing open power chords while the synth continues to do more of that octave stuff I mentioned earlier. The only other element to mention is a harsh sync synth underneath everything bouncing between octaves of the tonic. And this brings us to the end of the track, where it loops back into the A section. So after all of that explanation, I'll let the final track play out. This is Zealous Battle. So hopefully, after all of that long-winded explanation and rambling, you got something out of this. I've been meaning to make this video for a long time now, so I hope it was enjoyable and that you learned something. If anything, I hope that you found some new PS2 era Meguro tracks to listen to, or maybe even some of my own. Obviously there is info that we might learn after this video comes out about certain instruments or libraries, and I'm sure that someone could explain this stuff better than I could. I've been a fan of Shin Megami Tensei for years and years, and it feels strangely cathartic to finally analyse and write down what I love so much about its music. And sorry for the long gaps on the channel recently. I've been pretty busy with some soundtrack works for a few games, so stay tuned for those in the future. As for this channel, I've really wanted to make my own style of remixes for a while instead of just sticking to Meguro stuff. I don't plan to necessarily stop making Meguro mixes in the future, but I wanted to make this guide to sort of help other people to make their own, somewhat in a passing of the torch sense. I'll keep making them for sure, but I'd love to branch out and do some other music related stuff on this channel. Would you guys like to see other remixes? Potentially a Raidou Kazuka style song? Please leave a comment, I really want to hear what you guys are looking for. I would also love to make some videos about what makes other game soundtracks so good. I've got a lot of love to share for plenty of game music, new and old, so please let me know if that's interesting to you. Anyway, with all that said, thanks for watching and take care.